Thanks for joining our Bud Metheny uh, uh, November meeting. Our guest today is Danny Spewak. He's a reporter at KARE 11 News in Minneapolis. Danny joined KARE in May 2018 after spending 5 years as a reporter in WGRZ in serving Buffalo and Western New York. Danny grew up in St. Louis and graduated from the University of Missouri with degrees in journalism and political science. He's also a nonfiction author with 2 books on sports history. His first book, From the Gridiron to the Battlefield, Minnesota's March to a College Football Title and into World War II, was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Awards. Today, we're here to discuss Danny's second book, Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete and a Life Cut Short, which was released in March 2024. For those of you who don't know much about Charlie, Charlie was raised in southeastern Virginia and broke into professional baseball in 1950 with the Negro American League's Indianapolis Clowns, served his country for 2 years in the Army and then the Korean War, and then returned home to help integrate the Class B Piedmont League with the Portsmouth Merrimacs. So that's the tie to the Hampton Roads area. So with that, I'll turn it over to I'll turn it over to Danny to talk about Charlie. And before he gets going, I just have a leading question is, how did you become interested in Charlie Peete?
That's a really good question. So obviously, his major league time was with the St. Louis Cardinals. And so I'm a St. Louis native and huge Cardinals fan, lifelong fan. And so even amongst Cardinals fans, his name is really not very well known. I always joke that if you were to walk down the streets of St. Louis and ask 100 people who's Charlie Peete, I almost guarantee none of them would be able to tell you who he was. He only played 23 games in 1956. But left a real legacy with the franchise, and then of course tragically lost his life in a plane crash before he could ever really realize his potential. And so the story had been told a little bit. The Cardinals had a player in 2014, a top prospect named Oscar Taveras, who was killed if you remember that, he was killed in a transportation accident, a car accident in the Dominican, and that reawakened some stories about Charlie Peete about 10 years ago. That was when he first came on my radar as a St. Louis person, Cardinals fan. And then as I was researching book topics, more recently in the last 5 years or so, his name just kind of kept popping up because I thought his potential was so great. He was a top prospect. He could have been really one of the great players for the Cardinals in the 50s and 60s, and unfortunately never got to realize his dream. But even though this came on my radar because it was a St. Louis story to me, as I did more and more research, I really learned that the real crux of the story and the heart of the story was in Hampton Roads in Virginia, because it was where he was from. It was where he made his mark. And so that's why I was excited to be with you all today, because that was really probably the most gratifying part of the research process, was visiting when that was April of 2023. And getting to see where Pete walked the streets and seeing where he grew up. And so it's exciting to be able to talk about that and what molded him into a major league player.
Got it.
All right. So I'll get the screen share going here. Let's see. I know it's just an easy button, but for some reason I can't find it. Like
Oh, the maximize,
yeah, let's see. I have it here.
up. I think it's the one on the left, right? Yeah, there you go.
Is that okay right there? Can you see that?
Perfect.
Oh, great. Okay. All right. So Cardinal Dreams, The Legacy of Charlie Peete and a Life Cut Short, as you mentioned, published earlier this year by Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. And I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of who Charlie Peete was again. He was born in 1929, and he appeared in 23 games for St. Louis Cardinals in 1956. That was his big moment when he had risen through the minor leagues and was called up for kind of a 30-day trial sort of thing, but played in 23 games. After the season, as he was playing winter ball in South America, he was traveling to Venezuela to join another team. He was killed in a commercial plane crash that killed not only him, but also his wife and their 3 young kids. So just a devastating accident, and was a national news story, international news story, when the plane went down on that November day. Pete's legacy was really unwritten because he was a leading candidate to be the starting center fielder in 1957 with the St. Louis Cardinals. He really left a legacy as one of the first Black players in the Cardinals franchise, and had come up through the minor leagues and was really a trailblazer in that regard at a time when the Cardinals had been very slow to integrate along with the rest of the other early teams in the major leagues. And as I'll get into a little bit later, probably one of the most fascinating aspects of his death was the fact that when he died a year later, in '57, the Cardinals did not have a center fielder, and so after that next season, they went out and traded for Curt Flood. And
Mm,
without the Peete plane crash, there's some thought of, would Flood have ever come to the Cardinals? Would he have ever challenged the free agency system and opened the door to free agency with that
mm.
Supreme Court challenge? So Peete is a really interesting person just in baseball history, regardless of what he did on the field. So that's an overview of who Charlie Peete was. And let's get into his early life. He was born in Franklin. He didn't live a lot of time in Franklin, maybe a couple of years. He wouldn't have had much of a memory. Based on my research and going out and driving the area that he was from in Franklin, a very rural stretch of Franklin. And I think it's in the book, Smith's Ferry Road, I believe. It kind of goes right into the center of Franklin. And it looked like based on what I could tell, it looked like him and his family and extended family may have lived on a farm. They may have been sharecroppers. It's hard to tell. There's a lot of missing holes in his early research from 1929. But eventually, the family made their way to Portsmouth. His dad was in the carpentry business, and had worked a lot of different jobs in construction. Worked for some prominent builders in town. And they moved to Portsmouth. And based on what I can tell, if anyone familiar with Portsmouth, I believe it looks like the neighborhood he was from based on the maps. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was right near where currently IC Norcom High School is, which is where Portsmouth Stadium, Frank D. Lawrence Stadium, later called, where that was located. So he grew up across the street from the stadium in Portsmouth. And I think about that because I think of the exposure he would have had to high level baseball. Obviously, at the time, it was segregated seating for the Portsmouth Truckers and then the Cubs. But a lot of Negro Leagues teams came through too. So he would have seen some really good baseball. Josh Gibson, Buck Leonard all played there. So he would have seen some really good baseball being across the street from the stadium there. So he becomes nicknamed Pistol Pete early in his career in the late 40s when he joins the semi-pro circuit. He had attended IC Norcom High School, didn't graduate, and there's some holes in the story in terms of if you talk to former coaches and people that knew him back in the day of how much he really played. They didn't have a baseball team at Norcom at the time, and they had different sports he played. It looked like football and maybe some track, but there's some kind of difficulty in figuring out what exactly he did at IC Norcom, but he made his athletic name really in the semi-pro circuit. And yeah, it was nicknamed Pistol Pete. He was a great baseball player, also a football player, played for some YMCA teams. So that was when he emerged as really one of the better baseball players on the circuit there in Portsmouth, and played for teams like the Portsmouth Barons. There was a team called the Athletics that he played for. They changed names every year, but really where he cut his teeth and became a great baseball player. He signed finally professionally for the first time in 1950 with the Indianapolis Clowns of the Negro American League. And the Society for American Baseball Research, just in about the last 6 months, classified the 1950 NAL as a major league quality league, because there were a lot of great players. The Monarchs at the time still had Buck O'Neil and Elston Howard, and Ernie Banks was in the league that year. So Pete didn't play a lot when he first joined the Clowns, but he did get exposed to those really high level Hall of Famers in the league. And it was, just for some perspective, it was just a year or two later that Hank Aaron joined the Clowns. And that was where Hank Aaron became, kind of on his path to glory. And so just gives you a little perspective on just what it meant that Pete was playing for a team of that caliber, even though he didn't get a lot of playing time. So then in the middle of the season, he transfers up to, was really interesting aspect of his career, a team in Western Manitoba out in Canada, Western Canada, with the Brandon Grays. And they just loved baseball up there at the time. And there were some amazing players in that league. it was a lot of African-American players that they didn't feel they were getting opportunities in America. So they'd go up to Canada, and Leon Day and Willie Wells were in the league. And so again, playing against some really high level players, and was kind of a hidden gem, that league, in baseball history. So he plays there for about a year, half of a year, and kind of comes into his own as a power hitter. He's at this point really a primary outfielder, left-handed hitter. And then the Korean War starts. So he ends up being stationed both in Korea but also Japan at times. And all of his archives were destroyed in a fire in the 70s, and so at the National Archives in St. Louis. So we can't tell exactly like where he served and what he did, but we know he was in a quartermaster group, and had kind of bounced around and played baseball while I was in Korea, and actually said that his time in Korea playing baseball was what kind of set him on a path to professional baseball. He credited that as a time when he really came into his own as a player as well. Times are changing in the 50s. And in the Piedmont League, finally the Southern leagues, in some of the Southern minor leagues, are starting to integrate, and that's no different than the Piedmont League, Class B league, that had a team in Portsmouth. Peete becomes aware that this is becoming a possibility when he's overseas, when he's over in Korea, and he comes back, and he had grown up across the street from the stadium, so he apparently walked into Frank D. Lawrence, the owner's office, and a lot of different stories were told about what actually happened. But he basically said, "I'm here and I want to play," and they gave him an opportunity, and he became one of the better players in the league. Played 2 years in the Piedmont League with the Merrimacs, who had been called the Cubs previously. And was a key player in helping to integrate the league and setting them up for the future, but also became a great outfielder, and hit a grand slam in his first game. And that was still, to this day, if you talk to people about that grand slam, there are still people that remember him. If you know the name Sam Allen from your area, Sam remembers that vividly, and I got to talk with him, and he said it was a really moment of pride. So very interesting time for Peete there in the 50s. This right here is a picture of Pete with the Brandon Grays, and that was when he was up in Canada. That's him on the left there. I think that's during warmups. This is kind of an epic photo that one of those players' families had kept for years and years, and it's like one of the only photos that you'll see of him playing in Canada. So it's kind of fun to just kind of look in the background, look at those guys, and just just kind of think about what baseball would have been like in Canada in 1950. So in 1954, he's become a star with the Portsmouth Merrimacs. He's an all-star in the Piedmont League. Frank D. Lawrence is an owner that has connections all across the major leagues. And we don't know exactly why the Cardinals drafted Peete in late 1954, but I think it has something to do with Lawrence had been very connected with some of the Cardinal teams. And the manager for part of the 54 season was Pepper Martin, who was a great player for the Cardinals World Series teams in the 30s. So there's some thought that there was a connection that led the Cardinals to figure out that Peete was a real star. So they draft him in 1954, and he's among the first wave of black players under the new owner of Gussie Busch. So Anheuser-Busch, the Busch family, was the new owners in the 50s, and they were much more forward thinking than the previous guys had been, who had pretty much upheld the segregated team. But that changed under Gussie Busch, and Peete was part of that new era. So they sent him straight to AAA, because when he was with the Portsmouth Merrimacs, he was a legitimate star, and there were teams that even wanted to take him straight to the major leagues because he had played that well. And ended up that he was in AAA with the Cardinals organization. They had two AAA teams at the time: Rochester, New York, and Omaha, Nebraska. So he plays in 55, and there's him on the bottom left there, sitting down in that bottom row. And he became an all-star with the American Association in 1956. So each time it was interesting in the Piedmont League, and then in the AAA level, it took him like a year to acclimate. His first year was always a little bit rough, not rough, but just sort of, acclimating himself. And then it was that second year each time in those two levels where he became an all-star. And when he became an all-star in the American Association, this is what really makes him a major league prospect. So at this time, he's one of the top prospects for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he finally gets his call up in July of 56. This is him playing in AAA. This was interesting that just kind of shows he was, you can't really see him there. You can see him sliding into third base, but he was really known as a daring, aggressive base runner, and he had learned that in the Negro leagues because there was a lot of aggressive, really good base running that much more daring at that time, and he really took that competitive mentality when we went into AAA and then into the majors. So he's promoted in July of 1956. He goes to bat against the Pittsburgh Pirates on July 17th at home at Busch Stadium, which was previously called Sportsman's Park. So this is 2 stadiums ago in St. Louis. So, you can't sugarcoat it. He hit only 192 in 23 games. He had some big moments. He had like a game-winning triple against the Philadelphia Phillies and Robin Roberts. He had a 3-hit game at one point. It wasn't all bad, but he was platooning. He was a lefty that was playing only really against right-handed pitchers. So he never really got his groove, and he didn't hit as well as maybe he thought he would. And he had kind of a lingering wrist injury, although he wouldn't give any excuses. But anyway, it was his trial. We've seen prospects come up and they don't hit that well in the first month. His fielding was really what probably set him apart. There were actually reports at the time that his throwing arm was so strong that the crowd would actually make a noise when the first time he threw the ball from center field. That the crowd was impressed by that and his range. He didn't make any errors in his 23 games. Perfect fielding percentage. Threw out 2 Dodger base runners on outfield assists in the same game at one point when he was able to actually step on the same field as Jackie Robinson in Robinson's final season. So his fielding was top notch and major league quality. His hitting wasn't quite there, but when he was demoted to Omaha back to Omaha in August, he ended up finishing out the season in the American Association and was the batting champion, hit 350. So just everything together setting him up for a really great career. And probably a 1957 starting position in center field with the St. Louis Cardinals. He at least would have had a chance to be a great player. So he's come through the minor leagues. He's become a star in the minor league level. He's become a top major league prospect that the Cardinals are counting on to maybe be a starter. And just an awful, awful situation as he's traveling to Caracas, Venezuela, for a winter league. He had been in Cuba playing and he got cut from a Cuban team, and winter league was very common back then especially for prospects just trying to get winter league experience down where it was nice weather in South America during the off season. So tragically, he's cut from a Cuban team in November, and instead of just going to Venezuela right away, he actually goes back home to pick up his wife and the 3 kids. And the youngest was like an infant. So you're talking 3 really young kids, and they wanted to travel together so they could be in Venezuela for Christmas. And just an awful, awful thing that when they fly in out of what ended up being New York, they fly from New York to Venezuela, and that flight crashes. 253 crashes just a few miles from the airport. They're almost there. It was cloudy weather, pilot error, just an awful, awful crash, and all 25 people on board were killed. And the Peete family was 5 out of the 25. It was national news. You can see that Associated Press, New York Times picked it up. And in the next slide here was even top international news in Venezuela. And when I presented this at the SABR conference in Minneapolis, it was interesting. There was a Spanish speaker who actually was able to translate this. And I was translated a little bit of it for the book, but he was really able to read it and help me kind of understand what exactly was happening here. So he was, front page news and a lot of mourning going on, and a lot of people that remembered watching him because the previous season he had played in Venezuela and was a really good player. And so a lot of the Venezuelan fans remembered him, and actually the Cuban fans did too. So his death was an impact in South America, in St. Louis, obviously, in places like Omaha and Rochester, New York, where he'd played, and then of course, above all, in Portsmouth and in Hampton Roads. There was a huge funeral for him in Portsmouth, and that was also highly covered by the media outlets at the time. And just a big blow because the fact that he had come from Portsmouth and had made a name in the major leagues, it was really a point of pride for the community, and very sad when he was killed. So his legacy is a lot of, there's a lot of different ways to look at his legacy. One is that he was, to my knowledge, the first major leaguer in history to die in a commercial plane crash. There have been some that have been killed in military accidents, but he was killed in a commercial crash that at the time was becoming more popular to travel that way in the 50s. And in the mid 50s, there had been several major accidents. This was one of them that led to a lot of reform at the federal level to make air travel safer. So that was part of his legacy. But really, when I did the research, I started this book thinking that I would be trying to write a story about a player that was killed in a crash. But what I realized was that he really left a legacy in what he did before he died. And a lot of his story was about what he did while he was alive and not just simply this tragic way that he died. And I think the biggest way to look at it is that I think he really paved the way for the groundbreaking Cardinal teams of the 60s. You look at him in the 50s, and the Cardinals weren't a great team in the 50s, but in the 60s, they went to 3 World Series and they won in 1964 and 1967. And he paved the way for what was really kind of became a groundbreaking organization. Bob Gibson, Lou Brock, Bill White. It was a very diverse team, and the 64 series against the Yankees was kind of considered to this day kind of a landmark victory because it was a team that had embraced the future of integrated baseball, and the Yankees really hadn't at the time. And the Cardinals defeated them, defeating Mickey Mantle and kind of the old guard. So that was a big deal, and I think Pete paved the way for that because he came in at a time when it was really hard to make a name for yourself as an African-American ball player with the Cardinals. It was very new for the organization, and he faced a lot of difficulties in that. But I think he really set up those next wave of players, and I think Cardinals fans and baseball fans can appreciate that. And at home in Portsmouth, there is a Charles Peete Little League. So it's down in the Truxton neighborhood. There's a field that is still there, and there's a Charles Peete Little League that's been operating for 60 years. And that was a really fun part for me, was traveling and meeting some of the kind of the older adults who had played as kids, and then now they're coaching. And it's a real point of pride. And I actually just saw the Portsmouth City Council is upgrading the field like in the last month or so. So yeah, you may have seen that. Yeah. So that'll be fun. I think the league's taking off again. And got to talk with some of the people who knew the founders, and it was really a point of pride for the community. And that's the way that Charles Peete is known at home. If anybody knows the name and knows that league, there were some really good players. Dorian Finney-Smith played in the Peete Little League, and now in the NBA, obviously. LaShawn Merritt, the track star. Just a lot of really good, really great athletes out of Hampton Roads ended up actually playing in that league. So that's a great legacy to this day. Kids still know Charles Peete through the Little League that bears his name. And the last thing I'll mention is just the Curt Flood connection. I kind of went back and forth in the book about, when Pete dies, as I mentioned, the Cardinals had to shift Ken Boyer from third base to center field, and it wasn't their preference. So after the 57 season, with Pete having died the year before in 56, they decided to go out and get Curt Flood from Cincinnati, and he had been an infielder in Cincinnati, but they thought he could play outfield. Now, do they do that if they have Pete in center field? Pete is still alive and he plays great in 1957. There's some thought that maybe they wouldn't have gotten Curt Flood. I think they may have still, just because the position was up in the air. But you think about that really for baseball history. If Flood wasn't in St. Louis, and he obviously was a key player on the World Series teams in the 60s, but it was his Supreme Court challenge, at the end of his time in St. Louis that opened the door to free agency. And you just wonder if those pieces had all come together if Pete hadn't died. So it's just kind of a hidden story in baseball history. That's what really made me gravitate toward it. It's a name that I wouldn't expect anyone to know. But I think it's really important that his legacy be told widely. And I think it's the most important that his name is still well known in Hampton Roads and in Tidewater area of Virginia. So that's why it's exciting to be here today. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I think I had heard of the Little League, but I didn't know who it was named after.
So, yeah.
I'm in the Virginia
Yeah.
Beach, Chesapeake area, so I'm not really
Yeah.
out of Portsmouth that much.
Mhm.
And Drew says he apologizes. His computer totally crashed. That's why he's not here.
Oh, that's
And
okay.
because he's the host, he can't
Yeah.
sign in because he
Oh.
needs to be the one to approve it. He's been texting me like, man, tell him I'm real sorry.
I wonder if I can let him in. Oh no. Oh, I thought I saw somebody joining. Maybe that was him.
It might have been. He said he's having trouble getting back in, and he was like texting me.
Oh no.
But I thought it was interesting. You talked about Sam Allen. He goes to all the local baseball card shows here, and he signs autographs.
Oh, sure.
I talked to him 2 weeks ago. I was at a baseball card show.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah.
I got his autograph again. I've got several of his cards just to
Yeah.
see him. I said, "Let me talk to Sam," and
yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Like,
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of him before this, so
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you said that you knew the Little League but not necessarily the name. That was what I found, like almost every person I talked to. I worked with someone that worked at one of the museums in Portsmouth, and we went around Portsmouth and we just like walked up to random people and we said, "Do you know who Charles Peete is?" Just see if anybody knew.
Yeah.
Everyone, some people would say no, but a lot of people would just say, "Oh, you mean the baseball league?" And they say, "Yeah, but he was a real player. He was a really an actual major league player." And so I think people thought that was a cool piece of history. So
That is cool. It's cool because I mean, you hear somebody's name in the Little League, you think maybe they're the founder. You don't
yeah,
realize,
right,
who is named after.
yeah, and to think that it was a major leaguer, and I think for the kids now, it's kind of fun to think like, wow, I mean, he was in the majors, so maybe I could do it too. So
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was interesting. He spent, you said about him being in the war and
uh
him playing during the wartime. I found that interesting. Did you have a hard time finding information about his playing days then? Playing.
Yeah, it was sometimes. The nice thing is with the newspaper archives online, you can find a lot
Mhm.
of stuff that you would never be able to find. But yeah, the war part was really hard because I had like one document that actually the National Archives was able to send me. So it was like his Army discharge form. So that told
Mhm.
me at least like the dates and when he was there, when he left. But it was hard to figure out like where he was and what exactly he did. I don't think he saw combat, but I think he was there at least for a year and a half or 2 years, and talked a lot in his later life about his baseball time over there when they were playing on the base and stuff like that. So that
Yeah,
was
I got a great uncle that played in the minors in the 40s and 50s. And he's
oh, okay.
passed on now. And
Yeah,
I've been using newspaper.com and archives and
yeah,
researching his minor league record. And
yeah.
I know that he was in World War II. Now, he
Uh,
did see combat. He actually got shot in the shoulder by
whoa,
an SS soldier in Germany.
wow.
But
Hmm.
I don't know if he played any during training. I see a lot of these guys were playing
Yeah,
while they were training and stuff, and I
yeah,
cannot find anything if he did or not, and nobody
yeah.
knows in the family.
Yeah, it's almost like I feel like nice thing is they keep adding newspapers like every
Yeah.
year you'll have more and more. So maybe one day there'll be that gym that'll pop up. But where did he play baseball?
So he played mostly in Florida, but he
Mhm.
he played all around. He played for the West Palm Beach Indians. He played
Okay.
in Red Springs,
Oh,
in the
cool.
Tobacco League,
Oh,
and,
nice.
and he played with Bobby Shantz in 1948 in Lincoln.
Oh, wow.
He was
Okay.
in the athletics organization the majority of his career, and he spent a little
Okay.
time in the Cubs and
Huh.
in the Pirates organization.
Oh, cool.
So,
Cool.
but his career starts. He was actually drafted or picked up, signed by the Red Sox in 42, but then in 44 or 45, he goes into the Army and goes into World War II.
Oh, sure.
And he was there at D-Day, and he went all the way
Wow.
to Germany and got shot by an SS soldier in his shoulder.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
he came back and played again in West Palm, which he played for the West Palm Beach Indians, where he grew
Wow.
up, I think 3 different times, and they're all spread out.
That's amazing that he played after he was shot, that he came
Yeah,
back and he was able to still play. That's incredible.
yeah. And when I was little, he'd tell me about his playing days, but I never thought to ask him how that did affect his playing. You don't think that
Yeah,
when you're a
right.
kid.
Yeah, yeah.
And I
You don't
knew him
know.
in my 20s and stuff, but he always lived out of state, and we'd write each other every now and then. And
Yeah, yeah,
he told me about some of his stuff, and they
yeah,
didn't really make any money back then. So he said he had to
yeah.
drive a taxi cab on it. The days he wasn't pitching,
Oh, right. When he was a bit,
he
yeah.
drove a taxi cab.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Even the major leaguers weren't making a lot of money back
Yeah.
then. So
So he'd be like, "Yeah, if I was off that day, I made sure I did
yeah.
a lot of work that I could, and then get to the game in time and all that kind of stuff." So
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
it was real
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
But Drew says he's sorry. But
That's okay. Tell him it's no big deal. As long as the recording works, I think.
that's what I told him. It shows on my screen that it's still recording.
Yeah. So I think when it ends, maybe it should still work. So
Yeah,
yeah,
but
that's
it was
okay.
great talking to you, man. I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
buy
You
your
too.
book off Amazon and check it out.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that. I think you'll like it. There's a lot in there about just about Virginia and his time growing up and so yeah, that was a really fun part for me. And yeah, I had trouble figuring out where his house was because it's gone. It's like a strip mall
Yeah.
now. But I think I found it, and I found an old map that showed exactly where it was. So that was kind of a thrill. So
All right. Good deal, man. Well, I'll
Awesome.
let you go. It was nice talking to you, Dan.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Robert. Thanks for
All
being
right.
here. And yeah, you can tell Drew that hopefully hopefully the recording comes through. So
Okay.
right.
Thank you, David.
Sounds
Danny.
good. Yeah, take care. Bye.
Huh?